Hi, in this video I'm going to go over how to attach your undercollar to your jacket. So I'm just going to flip this over so you can see it a little better. So your undercollar is the collar that is underneath your upper collar. It's the one that actually attaches to the outer shell of your jacket, while this one attaches to your facing. So you are going to need the one that you did your pad stitching on. It was cut on the bias. It was two separate pieces. It looks like this, okay? So this is the one, this is after you've already done your pad stitching. So when you are attaching this, there's a couple of areas that you need to pay attention to. Your center back seam should line up with the center back of the jacket. You should have a matching notch that matches it up to your shoulder seams. And then you have your break point. So your break point is where the lapel and the collar separate, and the collar goes separately in its direction and the lapel goes separately in its direction. So when I take my sample, I'm going to be lining this up. Now I'm going to be sewing this on the machine sewn way. So let's just go back here for a second. So this half was sewn on by machine. This half was sewn on by hand. So I'm going to be demonstrating this way today. And then we need it like this. So I've just laid my jacket out. So here's my front, that's my back. I put a piece of paper under there so you can see the contrast of that neckline. So I've already stay stitched the neckline from the shoulder to the center back, from the shoulder to the center back, from the shoulder to the center front, or up to the lapel point, and from the shoulder to the lapel point. Okay. So now I'm going to lay my two pieces right sides together, matching my center back, and start pinning that together. So I'm just going to match it there. And then you should have, from your pattern piece, marked your shoulder notch. So I just have a little chalk mark there representing my shoulder notch, and that should roughly hit that point. So mine points to the point where it actually meets. It doesn't actually meet where my shoulder seam is. This is so small, it's hard. It was very hard for me to get it to match or to draft this pattern. Okay, so everything along this edge should line up. Now here's the tricky part. You have to get this curve that's going up to the left and this curve that's going down to the right to match up. So if by lifting this up and smoothing the fabric out underneath, and then curling this to meet, you can get them to line up. Now I'm going to pin it and then I'm going to baste it just to double check. And you can walk your pattern pieces around. So I should demonstrate that. Let me just demonstrate that quickly. Just to check to make sure that everything fits nicely. So you just walk your pattern piece by coming around, pivoting on your seam, like on your stitching line, which is just inside or outside that canvas, and then just pivoting and turning, always on my stitching line. And then I should be able to keep turning, and then this corner should match my break point. Now my break point has moved ever so slightly on this pattern since I originally did it, and it's now 1.5 inches in from the lapel front edge. So and 1/2 inch in because that's my seam allowance. So that should be my new break point on both sides. So I've marked that 1.5 inch in and 1/2 inch down, and repeated 1.5 inch in and 1/2 inch down. So now I can pin this, and then you would, if you want, you can check it on the other side. Your walk your pattern on your other side. So always just turning ever so slightly on your seam allowance mark. And then when I get there, so this one I can tell that I'm going to be needing to ease it just a little bit more around that corner. Okay, so pinning it here, lining up my center back, pinning it here, lining up that shoulder mark here and here. You shouldn't have any ripples of fabric or gathering underneath there. Okay, And then I'm going to be, I might have ripples in the seam allowance, but right here where they're going to be sewn together, it should be smooth. And that's what I'm looking for as I pin. And I'm just, like I said, right where I'm stitching, no wrinkles, but I can wrinkle the seam allowance of the undercollar. All the way to my break point. I'm just going to pin just a little bit past so I know that these are going to be lined up. Okay, even though I'm only going to be stitching from exactly here around and around, I'm going to pin it all the way to there. So do not stitch past. So at this point, you must do a lock stitch because it's nearly impossible to back stitch perfectly into that corner. Just going to repeat this on my other side. Just because I don't like being poked so much, I'm going to go ahead and baste this down, then I will use it or take it to the machine and sew it. Okay, so I've pinned it, so I had to just double check that your break points are the same on both sides. Now this is really tight here on the jacket side and really ripply on the collar side. So it isn't easy to get this pinned, and some patterns will even have you, so I have a little bubble here, so I'm gonna flatten that up. Will have you cut into the seam allowance on the jacket side, but this seam allowance is eventually going to be pushed up into the collar, so it's not really necessary, but it does make it sewing easier, but it also weakens the jacket neckline. So if you can avoid it, try to avoid clipping that and just sew it. So now I'm going to baste it and then we will start machine sewing it. So I just want to make sure I backstitch, like do a nice backstitch here, and I'm going to just baste it just outside my stitching line so that I don't actually stitch over my basting stitches. So I'm just outside of my canvas is where I'm basting it. So I did a little back stitch, just smoothing that jacket fabric on the back side, and I did wax my basting thread. Take a couple of those pins. So I'm really feeling that the jacket side of this is smooth and flat, and this edge where the collar and the jacket meet should be perfectly even. As soon as I go over those pins with my basting, I can take them out. Again, just make sure your edges are even. Lost my thimble. And right here is where it's the worst, where it's the undercollar is the most, the seam allowance of the undercollar is the most wrinkled and ripply, and the jacket is really tight. So just do your best to keep those right in line, like smooth, right where the seam allowance is. Okay, so I'm just about to finish basting the last little bit here. I just want to make sure I get the jacket fabric, prevent the jacket fabric from buckling or anything. And then here, that's my lapel break point. So I'm just making sure that I backstitch there because that's where I'm going to have to do my lock stitch. Okay, so I can take these pins out now that I've got it basted. And then we'll take this to the machine and sew it on. Let's do an extra stitch there. Okay, and so what you're going to check with that basting is that you don't have any bubbles or puckers around that seam, and then this should be able to split still, so we don't sew all the way to the end. You want to make sure that you have that stopping right at the point. So all across here, your center back should line up, your shoulder notch should more or less line up. Again, my pattern's not great. And then again, this separates, so we don't go all the way to the end there. We stopped. So okay, so I will be stitching this, and then like notice how much that collar seam allowance is rippling, but not where it's basted. Okay, so that is all rippling and bunched up there. You can see that, but my edges are even on my jacket side of things. I don't have any pulling or puckering. Like here, when I stitch this, I'm going to just move that out of the way and flatten it out. So make sure that your seam allowances are in place. They're not flipped over or anything awkwardly, so that you can stitch that all the way around. Okay, so I'm at the sewing machine. I have my corner or my needle set up so it's going to be exactly at the corner of my break point, and I'm going to do 3 lock stitches. So I've reduced my length down to 0, did 3 stitches, and then I'm going to put it back up to 3, and then that will allow me to sew that and not have it break at that point. Okay, I also recommend that if you have the ability to set your machine up so that the needle always stops down, this will really help you with this, because as you're manipulating the fabric, you're going to be pulling and jerking on it, and that's going to shift it, and then you're going to end up with lightning bolt stitches rather than smooth stitching lines. So if you can position it so your needle is down, do so. So I'm just going to sew right next to my canvas because that's my 1/2 inch seam allowance line. And that's the line that I basted right next to. Now I feel lots of twists and turns, and I'm probably not allowing you to see very well, but hopefully this will allow you to see enough. So right here where it's really twisted, it's hard for me to, I can't push the fabric down. I kind of have to hold it up to maintain that curvature. So unfortunately it's blocking your view. So I'm just feeling that underneath it's clear, flat and smooth. up here, I can see that my two edges are no longer even, so I'm just going to give this a little pull, and I pulled out my basting, so I'm going to go a little bit, and then I'm going to rotate this around just a little, and lift up my foot, rotate it around a little more, rotate it around a little more, and hopefully, I can't quite see my point, but I can see the edge of my canvas, so I'm going to go right here. Now here, you should be able to backstitch, but you could also lock stitch it, so just reducing down and sewing with it, the needle not moving. Okay, and then so let's see how we did. So it looks good. Pucker free on that side. Oh, looks like I got a pucker on this side, so I didn't quite get it smooth. Now may be able to iron those out because it's pretty small, so I might, I don't know if you can see that, it's a little pucker right there, so I might be able to iron that smooth. If this is wool, I could definitely do that, but because this is cotton, so it's able to smooth it a little bit. So actually the rest of it's not bad. And if I can't get it out, then opening this up and redoing that little bit of the curve shouldn't be too bad. But I did get a tiniest little pucker there. So this is what your collar should look like on, your under collar should look like on the inside. And then you're gonna press the seam up, and you are gonna trim and grade the seam allowance. So you're going to reduce the bulk of your under collar just a little bit. So take that down to a 1/4 inch. And then this one, you can take it down to 3/8 of an inch. So this is 1/2 inch seam allowances. So you can reduce that down. And then, so I'm just trying to see where that was on the inside. Right there. Oh, I see, because I went over the canvas there, so I probably will take that out and just redo that just a little bit, smoothing it a little bit better to fix that. Okay, so I just cut just right here. I'm missing some stitches, so I'm going to overlap my stitches. So I just had just a little lock stitch there. Just because that way I don't have a bulky stitch. And then I'm just going to go around that corner, trying to maintain my seam allowance line and find where exactly my other stitches are, so I can just barely see them. And I just do a little back stitch. I don't want to do back stitches on a curve, so you want to make sure you only do those on areas that are relatively straight. Otherwise, you'll never get the curvature to line up when you back stitch, or it's very difficult to anyway. Okay, so yeah, so pucker is now gone from that whole area. So now I can take this to the iron. And because I basted it just inside my stitching line, so my stitches are on this side and my basting's on this side, I don't have to take that basting out. It is okay to leave it in because it's not going to show, except for here where I caught the tail. Okay, so like I mentioned, you want to now grade that seam allowance so that the bulky canvas, or sorry, the bulky Melton is reduced to at least half, maybe just a little bit less than half. And that your jacket fabric is going to be trimmed down to 3/8, especially because our collar stand is only 3/8. We need the seam allowance to be reduced. So I'm just gonna taper off there for now. And here for now. Okay, so I didn't trim into that area yet. And then I'm cutting 1/8 of an inch off of my jacket. Now, in tailoring, we would press the seam up into the undercollar, which is what I'm going to do. In ready to wear, it is often pressed open, and then the upper collar would be pressed open. But I'm going to press these both up. That way I don't have to clip it. If you press it open, you have to clip this seam. If you press it up, you don't, because it reduces the, or it doesn't have to, you have plenty of fabric for it to come up and in. If anything, you would actually notch a little bit out, but we don't really have to because it's such a narrow seam. And at this corner, I'm just cutting it a little bit closer. I don't know if you can see what I did there. So just at this curve, I cut it a little closer because this curve will not lay flat if I don't. Which means I need to cut my Melton down just a little bit more there as well to actually have it graded. So I'll take just the iron and then we'll press this up, and then you can tack it. So a lot of tailoring will have you do a herringbone stitch here, tacking this seam flat and smooth. Again, you don't have to do that for your undercollar, but I'm going to, one, because I've cut my back stitching, so now it's coming undone there and I don't want that to come undone. And two, this will just keep it where I want it to go. One other point that I wanted to make is, I don't know if you can see on the camera, but my undercollar roll line is here and it should be a continuous line. So when this is folded back and down, there's no awkward break here. It just continues straight up, around, and again matches crease to crease here, right on there. So if you have basted it in the right spot and sewn it in the right spot, it will do that. And then we have our break point here so that later we can finish making, so you're going to sew this, your upper collar and your facing together, your front facing, back facing, and upper collar all together. And then that will all go in as one piece, and it has to all be a perfect match to this side. So those match points and precision are really important. At the ironing board, so I have laid this out on my pressing ham so that I can press that under collar and coat seam allowance up. And so this is going to be pressed up towards my collar, the seam allowance. And so I'm just going to kind of iron. So I am on my roll line here, but I'll press the crease back into it after I get this seam allowance pressed. Okay. And then I'm going to bring it around this way. So I don't want to press any unnecessary creases into my jacket, so I'm just trying to make sure that this is smooth and flat because that's where my iron's going to be. Again, let the iron do the work. You don't need to wiggle and push hard or anything. The heat and the steam do the work for you. Okay. All right, so then I can re-crease that roll line. Just again, make sure you're not accidentally putting creases where you don't want them, so smooth everything out underneath. Okay, so it should look like that there, and then the back of my undercollar is attached. When I flip this up, it should be pucker free, so if you want, you could also press it with the collar up and out of the way like this. Just to give that shoulder a nice clean, and you can see my pucker's now gone. Same thing on the other side. Okay, so then I'm going to hand stitch that seam allowance to my canvas. And so yeah, so now the underside of that collar is looking pretty good. So and if this is wool, it would look even better. Next thing is that hand stitching. Okay, so I'm going to just do a herringbone stitch right here. I don't think I quite trimmed that out enough. Hold on. So just right here, I want this really, like, so my break point's right at the edge of my thumb here, and I really want this to not be in my way when I go to sew that. So I just want to get that out of my way, because when I go to sew this seam allowance for my facing, I need a 1/2 inch seam allowance, but everything after that I do not need. So I just want to make sure I get rid of it. Same thing here where my break point is. I'll be sewing with a 1/2 inch to the upper collar, but everything after that can be reduced. So just really want to make sure that that's not thick and bulky in this area. Hopefully you can see what I just did. And same thing on this side, just right where my break point is, which is right there, up to that point. I want to get rid of it. And then more so on the Melton side, just because it's thicker and bulkier. Okay. All right, so hopefully I still have a threaded needle after all that. Okay, so so I will be clipping this. so that I can sew it to the facing, and then this half of the seam allowance will fold down, but this half will stay up. Okay, so I'm not going to stitch all the way to my break point. I'm going to start about 1/2 inch away so that this can be secured, but at the same time I can access that corner. Okay, so this is a herringbone stitch again, like I did previously on some of my samples. I like it because I can go just over the edge of my seam allowance, catching that canvas, and then back into the seam allowance. And you can go pretty deep into the seam allowance side because it's not going to show, but if I go too deep into the canvas side, then it's going to show through the melton. So don't go into the melton, you want to stay on the canvas. And I'm going just over the edge, which basically acts as a finishing stitch, so this edge can't possibly fray. Now this is a tailoring technique, but I really like it because it just really makes sure that seam allowance stays flat and smooth, and it just looks good inside, and take some pride in your work, even on the inside. So nobody's going to see this, unfortunately, but it really does make it look good. Do you have, like I said, some ready-to-made, usually what they do here is they clip into the jacket fabric and then open up that seam and press it open, like the two seams open, but it does make everything weaker, and so I personally don't recommend it. And then they do an edge stitch on the outside, so they would do a very narrow stitching line here and here, catching those two on that side. So that helps with the fact that they've clipped into it, but it's just not a look I want on my outside, so I'm doing the hand stitching. I'm just feeling to make sure that this is all flat and forming exactly like I want it to. Like, I don't want there to be any rolls or anything in this seam allowance side of things or the back. I want to make sure that this is all staying flat because this is my collar stand and it needs to be a bit rigid to lift that collar up so that it lifts this collar up so that it can fall the way that you want it to visually. Because my seam is opening here, I'm just going to do a little tack right here so that it cannot open anymore. Alright, so just like that, and then I'm going to go off the edge of onto the canvas just to make sure that it's secured. Alright, so that should solve that problem. And if I feel it come through the melton, I know I've gone too far, so just want to stay in the canvas. Thought I pulled that too hard. So. be running out of thread here before I get to the end. I'm actually good. Okay, so here is where I'm going to just do a back tack, securing my threads. All right, so that is finished inside, so nice and neat. And that's my front, or the outside, but under collar piece. So the inside all secure, so that seam allowance is nice, tidy, and very flat. So that is how you secure your under collar to your jacket. Other places might, or other patterns might actually have you sew your lapels on first, and then attach the under collar and then the over collar. But because we're doing a bagged lining, which means that all of this is going to be sewn in one continuous go, we will not be doing it, finishing the lapel first and then doing the collars like we're doing here.